asked you to sort of think about that, writing down what the Casorati-Weierstrass's theorem is in mathematical language. That means using your epsilon and delta and for all and there exists and whatnot and whatnot. Okay. And send it to me. So very few of you have sent it to me on email. Some of you have, so at least it's good to know that some of you have tried something about it. And let me tell you that everyone who has sent something has done something wrong. Okay. And this is something that you must, first of all, understand that you have a problem with this. Okay. And the problem you have is a problem of quantifiers. Okay. How do you put quantifiers in? And therefore, if you have problems with quantifiers, then what do? You either ignore all quantifiers or put all the quantifiers where they're not needed. So no one has given me the right answer yet. Okay. So, I mean, this is the point, that the first step in understanding something is to realize that you do not understand it yet. Okay. If you do not realize that you don't understand it, there's no way that you can understand it correctly. So the point here is that there are serious problems with quantifiers that all students have. Okay. And you have to sort of face your demons before the demons devour you. Okay. So much for all this. Okay, what do I have to do now? I have to share. No. What happened? Okay, which one is this? This is 50. This is not what I wanted to start off with. This is what I wanted to start off with. Okay. So as I said, the Casorati-Weierstrass's theorem says that the image of any arbitrarily small deleted neighborhood of an isolated essential singularity is dense in C. Okay. And the proof of this, I hope you have read this, is quite straightforward. Okay. And you have to say that suppose this is not true. So that's the other thing I wanted you to, maybe I should just stop and ask again. Have you people thought about, okay, first of all, can any of you sort of tell me what that epsilon delta statement is? Have you tried? Did you do it in the problem session, the last problem session you had? There's no response. I mean, people are sort of, you know, either you understand everything I'm doing or you understand nothing that I'm doing. This is the problem of, this is the drawback of staring on a screen with certain, what should one say, certain initials written there. The initials, I can't even see all the initials. I can only see I can only 7 or 8 of the initials here. Okay. And the trouble is that I have no idea. The speaker has no idea, first of all, if the audience is understanding what's going on, or even better, the speaker has no idea if the audience is present or not. Okay. So we all go under this illusion that when we are speaking to a screen like this, the students are present behind the screen. And there is no way of the speaker knowing whether that is true or not. Roshni, yes, you sent me something. Did you realize where you went wrong?
Sir, actually, I didn't understand where I went wrong.
Very good. So
But I
that's also,
understand the Kasurati-Weierstrass theorem, what he is trying to say.
you understand the theorem, but you cannot write it. Okay.
I
This
tried,
is the,
I made the best attempt to write.
I know. So this is the trouble. You see that you must understand that there is something to be understood. You may understand what the theorem is, but then when you try to write the theorem down, you have to be careful. Yes, it's one thing to write it in terms of the language, okay? And when you try to write it in terms of the language, there are things that are left hanging. When you try to make it precise, you have to understand that what you are trying to make precise, the precise thing that you have written down with ink on paper, that statement does not correspond to what you want it to mean. Okay, and this is the whole point. In fact, this is the basic thing about this is the basic idea among all of, everything in mathematics. You have to be very precise.
And sir,
Yeah,
in tutorial
yeah.
session, we did not discuss of writing Kasurati-Weierstrass theorem into mathematical language.
I know. This is the, there are many things that have to be done in the tutorials in
Yes,
the problem
yes,
session.
yes, yes.
Okay,
There are many.
and there are just too many to be done. You have only two problem sessions as it is. This is sort of a, super fast or express course in complex analysis. And in the problem session, there is just too much to be done. In this course, also, there's just too much that we have to think about. But the point is that I hope you understand that when I'm asking you to write down this Casorati-Weierstrass theorem, which has been explained what it means in terms of language, and I'm asking you to write it down precisely. That really does not have very much to do with the Casorati-Weierstrass theorem per se. It has to do with what is the meaning of there exists, what is the meaning of for all, what is the meaning of in every small neighborhood, no matter how small, okay? What is the meaning of arbitrarily close to, okay? What is the meaning of denseness? What is the meaning of arbitrarily? So these are the things that it has the what the exercise of writing it down does not have much to do with the Casorati-Weierstrass theorem, but it has to do with understanding what is the meaning of for all, what is the meaning of that exists, and okay, for all epsilon greater than zero, there exists a delta greater than zero. Okay, for all epsilon greater than zero, for all delta greater than zero. Where do you put brackets in this? What depends on what? How would you write it down? Okay, and most people, most students, even of mathematics, forget about other subjects, find this quite difficult to do, whereas they think that they know how to do this. And by the way, just uh, just 2 days ago, there was a newspaper report about some particular law, National Psychotropic Drugs Law, which the government had to. Did people read about this? The government had to bring in an amendment in the parliament, because what they didn't realize is that they made some modification of some clauses, and the way it was written, the structure of that statement was, the people who were writing it, who were drafting it, didn't realize that the structure of the statement made it so that what they wanted to say was not what was written down. Okay, in some sense, a mathematician's mind is very much like a lawyer's, because he must know exactly what each word means. And this is one example where you have to know exactly what each word means. That is why it is important to write it down. And let me assure you that, you know, if you have a class of 100 and this is done with a class of 100, not more than 4 or 5 people will be able to write it down correctly. Okay, students of mathematics, forget about other students who have finished their MSc in mathematics will find it difficult to write down the right statement. So you have to figure out, those of you who have sent me something, you have to figure out where it is wrong. And those of you who haven't sent me anything, there are two possibilities. Try to do something and see whether it is correct or not, send it to me. Or of course, do nothing and go ahead with the false understanding that you think you understand what the meaning of for all and there exists is, or how do you use for all and there exists. Okay, so please think about it. It's worthwhile thinking about. I'm not going to tell you what the answer is, okay, until I get someone who at least makes a. People have made attempts, but I've told those people that they are wrong, but I have not told them where they are wrong. Okay, so they have to figure out where they are wrong also. Anyway, so let's continue. Okay, where am I? I should go where? I should go. What do I do? I minimize this, I think. Minimize this. I minimize it. Yeah, this is being scared. This is being shared, no? Okay, so Casorati-Weierstrass's theorem, the image of any arbitrarily small deleted neighborhood of an isolated essential singularity is dense in C. Okay, and there's some statement of there's some proof that is given, which is not, as I say, is not. Oh, this is the end of this page, page 8 of 8. Okay, this is not particularly um, difficult or anything. Okay. So please read this. You should be able to show this. What you show is that suppose it is not true, and then therefore you must know the statement of the Casorati-Weierstrass's theorem is not true. Okay. Then you get some point, and then you do something with that point, and you define a function which is holomorphic and which is bounded, and therefore it has a removable singularity. But if it has a removable singularity, either you get a pole or you get a zero. Okay, that is the idea. So it's not at all difficult in this. Okay, so this was which page? This was page 49. So I should go to page 50. Is this page 50? No, what is this? 55. Hey, I just deleted it. Just hold on a moment, okay? Yeah, so this is being shared. I can see the red thing around it. So all of you can see this now. If you have this bounded function, and if it is not zero, then this is analytic. So it has a removable singularity. And if it has a pole, then if gz0 is 0, then it has a pole, and therefore you have a contradiction. So this says that you can get near an essential singularity, okay? The image of any neighborhood near an essential singularity is dense. And what I should tell you is that this is in fact a much weaker result than something else, which says that not just is it dense, what it says is that in any neighborhood of an essential singularity, the image of any neighborhood of an essential singularity is equal to the complex plane, except for one possible point. Okay. And you should be able to show this in the case of the particular function when you take e to the z, take exponential, I should have written this down, huh? That you take exponential fz equal to e to the power 1 by z for z not equal to 0. So this function is holomorphic in C minus 0. Okay. It has an essential singularity at z equal to 0. Okay. And you should verify that in any neighborhood of 0, e to the power 1 by z takes every value in C except one value. Which is the value it doesn't take? What is the value? Obviously, the value it doesn't take is a value that exponential doesn't take, which is 0. Okay. So you want e to the 1 by z takes every value except 0. Okay. And not only that, it takes this value infinitely often. Okay. So there's something called the Picard theorem, the great Picard theorem, which proves that. And that is actually quite a amazing result. You know, there are lots of very amazing results in complex analysis. So this is one of these amazing results that, and it's actually worthwhile to read the proof of one of these theorems at least once in your lifetime if you're going to do mathematics. Okay, independent of what mathematics you do, it is good to at least see the proof. You know, at least try to read the proof of one of these very large list of very amazing theorems that are true for complex holomorphic functions. Okay, even in one dimension, forget about what happens in many dimensions, but even in one dimension, there's quite a bit to be seen. Okay, so still you have to do this Casorati-Weierstrass's theorem, and then this is a observation that if you have a holomorphic function which has a 0, which is non-constant, then the 0 must have finite order. Okay, so fz is z minus z naught to the power n times gz, where g is holomorphic, and therefore f prime z over fz, okay, you can write it out as some n over z minus z naught plus gz, where gz is holomorphic, and so the residue at z naught of f prime z divided by fz is n. Okay, so it has a 0. If you have a pole which is isolated, then you know that fz is z minus z0 to the minus n. N is positive, where h is holomorphic, and therefore again you can write down f prime z over fz is this minus n over z minus z naught plus hz, where hz is holomorphic, and therefore the residue is minus n. Okay, and therefore the residue theorem of formula, which I had written down, is the sum of the residues, gives you the argument principle that if f is from some omega to c, c is a circle, f has finitely many zeros and poles inside c and none on c. You know, this is important, you have to check this, none on c. Then integral f prime over f prime z is the sum of the residues, and sum of the residues is zeros of f minus poles of f. Okay, and of course you have to count the zeros and the poles with multiplicity. And as usual, there are a huge family of exercises which uses this to evaluate various things, which we will also be doing a bit later on. Okay. And there's a similar kind of thing that if you have holomorphic functions, f and g, so this is the other idea. The idea is that, okay, if you have a holomorphic function and you perturb that holomorphic function, then certain properties of the perturbed function are the same as the properties of the original function. And usually when you say perturbed, what you mean is that the perturbation is small, okay, in some sense. So if you have a function f, I want to perturb the function f. So I want to perturb it by a function g. And g is supposed to be, in some sense, small when compared to f. Okay? I mean, this kind of thing is, you know, if you have the function 1 plus x, okay? No, what do I want to say? you have the function cos x. Okay. And no, don't take cos x, you take sin x. Okay. I should come up with the right example. Okay. I shouldn't make up this example as we go. Anyway, so you have a function f. The functions are holomorphic. Okay. And I want to perturb f. I want to change f by a small amount. What is small, etc., etc. You have to be careful of. So what I say is that you take f and you take a g, which is also holomorphic, and g is small when compared to f. Okay, mod f of z is greater than mod g of z. There's a strict inequality there for all z inside the region B. There's a inside B. Okay. Yeah, I shouldn't say for all z in C. I should say for all z in B. C is the boundary of B. Doesn't really matter. Okay, for all z in B. Then for all t in 0, 1, you know that f of z plus g of t times g of z. Okay, so g of z is strictly less than f of z. So you have f of z and g of z. Okay, and no matter where your g of z is, f of z plus t times g of z is not zero inside B. Why? Because if it is zero, then what you have is that f of z, g of z. So I should put a y there. Y is f of z plus g of z times t. It's in the straight line segment joining fz and g of z. Yeah. If g is not a multiple of f, this is the straight line segment, then therefore it doesn't go through 0. If g is a multiple of f, okay, then g is some lambda times f, but lambda must be less than 1, and then you have f of z plus lambda times f of z times t. Okay, this quantity cannot be 0. So this quantity is never 0. And therefore you look at this family of straight lines, ht of z, you look at this family of holomorphic functions, ht of z, which is fz plus t times g of z. Each of this is holomorphic, and for all t in 0, 1, this is non-zero, and this function is jointly continuous in z and t. Okay, as a function of z and t together, this is a function which is continuous and never 0. I can divide it by it. Because it's never 0, it is still jointly continuous on 0, 1 cross c. 0, 1 cross c is compact, and therefore when I take that integral is a continuous function of t. There's something to be done here. Okay, so you have a function which is uniformly continuous on a compact set, is continuous on a compact set. Therefore it is uniformly continuous. And therefore, when I have this nt, when I integrate it out with respect to one of the variables, it is still a continuous function of the remaining variable. Okay? So there's something to be understood here. You have to use uniform continuity. And uniform continuity comes from the fact that you have a continuous function on a compact set. And therefore, this n of t is a continuous function, but you know that it is an integer, and therefore, if you have a continuous integer valued function, okay, then it must be a constant. And therefore, n0 is n1. What is n0 is this, and this is the number of zeros of f, zeros and poles of f. This is zeros and poles of f and g, and therefore you get Rouché's theorem. If f and g are holomorphic, and fz is greater than gz, why did I say inside the circle? I don't want it just on the circle. I must have it inside the circle. Then fz and f plus gz have the same number of zeros inside C. Okay. So what it says is that I can perturb f by a small g. so that the number of zeros of f is the number of zeros of f plus g. Okay. And this also has quite a few applications. In fact, one of the applications of this is the fundamental theorem of algebra. Okay. Because why? Your f is z to the n plus something, something, something. Okay. So you take one function to be z to the n. The function z to the n has n zeros inside any circle, and you perturb that. You perturb that by something which has to be smaller than z to the n on a large circle. Okay, but you know that as the circle gets larger and larger, then all the other terms, z to the n minus 1, an minus 1, z to the n minus 1 plus an minus 2, z to the n, all those other terms are smaller than z to the n. So my f is z to the n, and my g is all the remaining terms of order less than or equal to n minus 1. Okay, so the remaining terms are smaller than the principal terms, the largest term, which is z to the n, and therefore the sum, which is the polynomial, has the same number of zeros as the function f, which is z to the n, which has n zeros. Therefore, you know that z to the n has n zeros, and therefore any polynomial of order n will have n zeros inside a sufficiently large circle. Okay, so I mean, this Rouché's theorem is part of this. Another proof of fundamental theorem of algebra, but it really doesn't help because Rouché's theorem is, again, comes from Cauchy's formula, etc., etc. So it doesn't really matter. And another consequence is this open mapping theorem. So when is a map open? When a map is continuous, inverse image of continuous set, inverse image of an open set is open. When is it open? If you have an open set in X, then the image of an open set is open. Okay, and you've been talking about quotient maps, and the relationship between quotient maps are open maps are quotient maps if it's onto. So I must ask, if you're doing all this business of the universal properties of quotient maps and whatever, okay, whether this kind of statement is done. If a map is closed or if it is open and it's onto, then it is a quotient map. Did you see this in your topology course? Because you were doing something with quotient maps some time ago, I think right now.
Yes, sir. This statement is closed.
Open. So did you show something with open maps?
Sir, I have done this exercise previously.
Anyway, so it's familiar with someone. Okay, so a map is open if images of open sets are open. And then what is the open mapping theorem? It says that a non-constant holomorphic function on a domain is open. Why is this true? Okay, so you have, this is your domain omega, z naught is a point in there, f z naught is w naught. Okay, and I want to show that the thing is open. So I must show that there is, so I want to take an open set here. I want to show it's open. So I want to do is that if you give it any point here, okay, so all points near W naught are in FW. That will tell you that the image is open. Okay, let W be near W naught. Okay, what do I mean by near? I have to be careful about that. And let GZ be FZ minus W. Okay, but FZ minus W, Z is the thing, okay, is supposed to be something near this Z naught, where W naught is F of Z naught. Okay, so what is Fz minus W? It is Fz minus W naught plus W naught minus W. That is Fz. This is my Fz, which is little fz minus W naught. And this is my Gz, which is W minus W naught. Okay. So I know that capital F is holomorphic, okay, and it's non-constant. and therefore there exists a neighborhood where fz is not equal to w naught on that delta neighborhood, on the circle this C is z naught delta. Okay. So therefore, if the function f is not 0 on this thing, that means fz is greater than epsilon. The distance, see, fz is not equal to w naught on this circle. This circle is compact. Okay, fz is not equal to w naught on the circle. Circle is compact, and so I do need it only at that point, so it doesn't matter. Image is compact, w naught is not in there, and therefore it's greater than epsilon, and therefore if w minus w naught is less than epsilon, fz is greater than gz and on the circle, and therefore you get the same number of zeros in f. Okay, gz has the same number of zeros inside C. Since f has a 0 inside C, therefore gz has a 0 inside C. So gz is what? Gz is this. This has a 0 inside C. So actually I need it only on the circle. I don't need it everywhere inside. And therefore a neighborhood of W naught is contained in that. Which neighborhood of W naught? So if z is greater than W naught for all z, if W minus W naught is less than this thing, okay, then W is in the image of that. Because that G of W has a, G of Z has a 0. So that's how I'm choosing that neighborhood. So holomorphic maps are open maps, okay? And by the way, this can be used, the thing with the book by Stein and Sakarchi is that they're doing all this with a very specific aim in mind. And therefore they don't spend too much time elaborating any of these ideas, okay? But the open mapping theorem also gives you a formula for the inverse function, okay? And it is useful to have that formula, that because it's open, therefore the inverse map is continuous and the inverse map is holomorphic. And there's a formula for the holomorphic inverse function theorem, that holomorphic for the, there's a formula for the inverse function of holomorphic functions using the Cauchy integral formula. In fact, using the residue formula. So I should tell you that also. Somewhere I think I mentioned residue equation. Now where is this? Residue theorem, argument principle, this business. So, I mean, you see, you could stick a function g in front of this f. So you look at g f prime z by fz, okay? And then what will you get? You will not just get the zeros, but you will get the value of g at those zeros and poles, okay? So there's a modification of this argument principle that is also important, okay? So as I said, this is the simple case of the argument principle, and there's a modification which sometimes is needed, okay, where this thing is you have a function g, integral of c of gz f prime z over fz, and that is not much of a modification. This is the plain vanilla argument principle, and there are fancier and fancier versions of this, okay? So Rouché's theorem, and then you have the open mapping theorem, and then there's a maximum modulus principle. So see, the point is that if you have the image must be open, then the maximum cannot occur at an interior point of the domain, and the domain is open. So the maximum cannot occur at any point in the domain. A non-constant holomorphic function on a domain omega cannot attain its maximum. In fact, it cannot attain any maximum, okay, in omega. If f did attain its maximum, f is open, So you take a disk around F naught, then Fd is open and it contains Fz naught. So Fz naught could not be the maximum of F in that neighborhood of D. Okay. So remember, this is a local business. So it's not just that it says that the holomorphic function cannot have any local maximum. Okay. Because you just restrict it to that neighborhood, then you'll get something which is maximum. So this maximum modulus principle also has quite a few versions. Okay. And these different versions are all, they get more and more powerful. But, even if they're powerful, this is the basic idea. Because the image is open, therefore the maximum cannot be attained. Okay. So good, this is the end of this. So 54. So I was thinking I'd do this next time, but anyway, now that I have the time, I can do it now. I have lots of time. So the date is wrong. Anyway, good. So if you have a holomorphic function, so let me pause here. People have questions so far, which you should be having, but anyway. Any questions so far? No. Okay, so continue. Continue where, how, minimize this. So this date is wrong, but anyway. And it's lecture 12 will be tomorrow. No, this is lecture 12 still continuing anyway. So if you have a holomorphic function on some disk, then you know it has a power series expansion, and you know that the nth coefficient of that power series, an, is given by this Cauchy's formula. Okay, so an multiplied by n factorial is the nth derivative. Okay, you just look at this series, you can take derivatives n times. So when you take a derivatives n times, you get an into n factorial is the nth derivative of f evaluated at z naught. When I did this, I didn't have, so an multiplied by n factorial is the nth derivative of f at z naught. But fn z naught is, we have shown this is Cauchy's integral formula, zeta minus z naught to the n plus 1. And now you're integrating over this circle. Circle has this parameterization, z naught plus r e raised to I theta, and therefore an is equal to 1 over 2 pi I. F zeta is z naught plus r e raised to I theta. Zeta minus z naught is r e raised to I theta to the power n plus 1. D zeta is r I e to the I theta d theta, and therefore an is that. Okay. So the nth coefficient for a holomorphic function is given by f zeta over zeta minus z naught d zeta. Okay. And similarly, if n is less than 0, this quantity is n is less than 0. So this quantity is holomorphic, and therefore the integral is equal to 0. So the point is that all these coefficients just come from an integral of the f. Okay. And therefore you'll get the mean value property. And if f is a0 is f of z0, and therefore f of z0 is a0 is this, which is f of z naught plus r e raised to I theta d theta. So the value of f at z naught is the mean of the value of f. This is the mean. I hope you have. So I should explain. This is actually the mean. Mean means the average. Okay. So the value of f at z naught is the average of the values of f on a circle of radius r around z naught. And remember, this is true for every r. Okay. I mean, the point here is that, so why is this an average? An average of a function, which will mean what? What is the average of a function over an interval? The average of the function or the mean of the function over an interval is you take the integral of the function over that interval and divide it by the length of the interval. Okay. The average of a function over a set is what? You'll take the integral of the function over the set and divide it by the size of the set, the measure of the set. So this is the mean. Okay. But this thing on the right hand side depends on r. Okay. So this is actually the mean with respect to the circle r, circle of radius r around z naught. And what are we saying? We are saying that no matter which r you take, if f is analytic in that ball, then the average of f at the center, the average of f around that boundary is the value of f at the center. Okay. And I hope you understand this also is a very strong property, that the value at a point is the average of its value on any circle around that point. Okay. The value at the center of the circle, the value of at a point is the average of the values of the function on any circle of any radius around that point. Okay. And those of you who know, this has to do, this also is a very important statement. And this statement also has lots of consequences in many areas of mathematics. Okay, so this statement, this is called the mean value property for holomorphic functions. And therefore, if you look at the real part of the function f, take real parts of both sides, okay, you will get that. If you have the real part of a holomorphic function, then the real part of a holomorphic function satisfies the same mean value property. Okay. We also know that the real part of a holomorphic function is harmonic. We have done this some time ago. Okay. Laplacian of u is equal to 0. And I don't think I did this, but one can show that if you have a harmonic function on the disk, then it has a harmonic conjugate v. And what is the harmonic conjugate v? V means that u plus iv, f equal to u plus iv is holomorphic. So if u is harmonic, then u satisfies the mean value property. Okay. And if u is harmonic, it has a harmonic conjugate v. On the disk, I'm talking of going on the disk. Okay, you have to worry about what region this thing is going on in. So on the disk, a harmonic function has a harmonic conjugate v, and with such that f equal to u plus iv is holomorphic. Okay, each of u and v satisfy the mean value property. And then of course the question you should ask is that, so let me say this again, the real part of a holomorphic function is harmonic and satisfies the mean value property. The imaginary part of a holomorphic function is harmonic and satisfies the mean value property. If you have a harmonic function, okay, then it has a harmonic conjugate V, and then F equal to U plus IV is holomorphic. Okay. What is the thing you should worry about here? So what is the question is that if U is the real part of holomorphic function, then U satisfies the mean value property. It has a complex conjugate. It has a conjugate function V. So if U is harmonic, then if U is harmonic, then it has a complex conjugate V. Okay. And then U plus IV is holomorphic. Okay. And once it's holomorphic, U satisfies the mean value property. Yes. So the question you should ask is that, so I have three ideas. I have holomorphic, I have harmonic, and I have the mean value property. Holomorphic means implies harmonic. Holomorphic implies mean value property. Harmonic implies holomorphic. For U and U plus IV is holomorphic. And harmonic implies holomorphic implies mean value property. So the question I should ask is,
does mean value property
imply
holomorphicities?
I mean, holomorphic comes from harmonic. Okay, if it's harmonic, then it's complex. Everything is going on the disk, so don't worry about domains. Okay, so harmonic implies harmonic, conjugate implies holomorphic, implies mean value. So the question you want to ask is that, does mean value property imply harmonic? Okay, that is an interesting question. If you have a function defined on the disk which satisfies the mean value property on the disk for every circle in the disk. So you have a function which satisfies the mean value property for any on a disk, okay, and anything inside that disk. The question is it harmonic? Okay, so how do you prove this? And you expect that the answer is yes. Okay, so there's a circle of ideas here which are what do I have to do? I have to minimize this. Okay, there's a circle of ideas here which have to be completed. Okay, so now I'm starting with another idea, which there are a bit too many ideas now. Anyway, let's start. Okay, so these set of ideas that I'm talking about here are actually as usual, they're very central to very large parts of mathematics, and what we are doing is the most basic. What we are doing here is the most basic, plain, simple statements of these ideas. And of course, there are more sophisticated versions of each of these ideas, okay, which are needed in different contexts, but the sophisticated version of these ideas you should learn at the time when you actually have some reason to learn them. Okay. Right now, what we are learning is the basic ideas in this subject. Okay. And we don't want to go into there is no need to go into any sophistication. My God, I should probably not be saying that. Some people will shout at me, but anyway. Okay, these are the basic ideas. So what do I want to do here? So here. So let's sort of build up the next set of ideas. If you have a holomorphic function on a disk, and gamma 1 and gamma 2 are any two curves in that disk, so I'm talking about a disk in particular, okay, with the same initial and end points, then integral over gamma 1 is equal to integral over gamma 2. Okay, why? Because I know that if you're on a disk and you have a holomorphic function on the disk, then it has a primitive, and no, I don't need primitive. The point is that why is this true? This is true because of Cauchy's theorem, because I can go along gamma 1 and come back along gamma 2. Okay, I have a closed curve, you have a holomorphic function, so the integral must be 0, and that means that the integral over gamma 1 minus the integral over gamma 2 is 0, and therefore integral over gamma 1 is equal to integral over gamma 2. Okay, this we have seen so often now. So if you have a holomorphic function on a disk and you have two curves in D with the same initial and end point, the integral does not depend on the curve. It depends only on the initial and end points. Okay. By the way, this idea also is very, in different contexts, it comes up over and over again. There's one place where this idea comes up in what are called covering spaces of graphs. Okay, zeta functions for graphs. Anyway, we'll see that. So the integrals depend only on the endpoints of that of the curve that you're talking about. Also, if you have a constant curve, that means gamma naught is a fixed point. See, the point is that you can think of a point as a point, and you can think of the point also as a curve. Which curve? It's the constant curve. Gamma naught of t is equal to z naught for all t in 0, 1. If gamma naught is the constant curve, then integral over gamma naught of fz dz is 0, because dz is 0. Okay. So integral over the constant curve is 0. Now suppose you have this curve gamma 1 and you have the curve gamma 2. Okay. And yeah, so, and I have a function which is holomorphic on some open set which contains D1 union D2, or which holomorphic function which contains gamma 1 and gamma 2. Okay. Of course, if I can find one disk that contains all of gamma 1 and which contains all of gamma 2, then I know by this first statement I made that the integral over gamma 1 is equal to integral over gamma 2, because I have a disk that contains both gamma 1 and gamma 2. However, suppose I cannot find one disk that contains gamma 1 and gamma 2. So I should think of these functions as defined on a domain omega, okay, on a larger set omega, okay. And if gamma 1 and gamma 2 are both contained in one disk contained in omega, then the previous statement applies. Integral will be the same. But suppose gamma 1 and gamma 2 are such that I cannot find one disk contained in omega which contains both gamma 1 and gamma 2. But I can find two disks. Okay, so that the union of these two disks, D1 and D2, where D1 and D2 are both contained in omega. So I want to say that the union of these two disks is contained in omega, and gamma 1 and gamma 2 are contained in the union of these two disks. Okay. Then my claim is that even now integral over gamma 1 is equal to integral over gamma 2. Okay. Why? Because you look at some points in gamma 1 which is in D1 intersection D2, similarly which we call A1. Similarly, you find D2 which is in gamma 2 which is in D1 intersection D2, and you break up gamma 1 going from Z0 to A1 and then from A1 to Z1, and you break up gamma 2 going from Z0 to D2 and from D2 to Z1. Okay, and D1 and D2 are both in D1. A1 and D2 are both in D1 in intersection D2. Bad notation as usual, big D1 and small D2 or whatever it is. Okay, and because they're in that intersection, you can find a path in D1 intersection D2 that goes from A1 to A2. D1 intersection D2 is path connected. Okay, and therefore integral of fz dz over gamma 1 is integral from z0 to A1. I hope you understand what this notation is. This notation z0 A1, A1 Z1 bar means you're going along the curve gamma 1 from Z0 to A1, and then you're going along the curve gamma 1 from A1 to Z1. What do? From A1, I come down to D2 and go back to A1 by some path in D1 intersection D2. So Z0 A1, A1 D2, D2 A1, A1 Z1. But Z0 A1 plus A1, Z0 A1 plus A1 D2, Z0 A1 plus A1 D2 is Z0 D2. Why? Because Z0 A1, A1 D2 are both, and Z0 D2 are both contained in D1, and they both have the same endpoint, namely D2. So the sum of these two is, so therefore I can use that previous thing, that's Z0 D2, and then you have D2 Z1. Okay, D2 A1, A1 Z1 is the same as D2 Z1 because they're both contained in, both these curves are contained in D2. Okay, and this sum of course is gamma 2. Okay, I hope this idea is clear. I'm just using this fact about a single disk. Suppose it's not a single disk, but I have two disks which contain the image. And then obviously the next stage will be that if there are points A1 to AN in gamma 1, D1 to DN in gamma 2, and a disk DI which contains A minus 1 AI from gamma 1, and DI also contains DI minus 1 DI from gamma 2. So instead of just having two, suppose I have n of them. I can break up the first into n parts, break up the second into n parts, and each of these curves, when you restrict it to that subcurve, is in one of these D2s. Okay, so the picture is, here is my curves gamma 1 and gamma 2. This part of it is contained in one of the DIs. Okay, then you break the whole thing up. For example, if you have the integral from here, AI minus 1 AI DI is the same as AI minus 1 DI minus 1 D2 DI. Okay, these two sums that I have are cancelling each other out. Is it clear what I mean there? Yes, no? I do the same idea, I'm just breaking it up into pieces, and I'm adding those little, paths in between. Yes, and the integral over those little paths all cancel out, and then I'm left with what I want. Okay, there's yeah, someone is saying something.
What if the disks do not intersect?
No. I'm saying if you can find curves, if you can find disks like this, okay, you can't find one disk. Suppose you can find two. You understood what I did when I found two disks, which I can break these up. I can break up gamma 1 into two parts, gamma 1 and gamma 1 and gamma 1 prime and gamma 2 prime. No, gamma 1 prime and gamma 1 double prime. I can break up gamma 2 into gamma 2 prime and gamma 2 double prime, such that gamma 1 prime and gamma 2 prime lie in a disk. Gamma 1 double prime and gamma 2 double prime lie in a disk. Okay, but then these two endpoints must be in the intersection, and therefore you can join these intersections. I'm saying suppose I can do this. Okay, then
Okay,
the
sir.
integrals are the same. Okay, yeah, and you understand what I mean, that instead of 2 I do the same thing with 3 disks. Okay, instead of 3 I can do it with any finite number of disks. Okay, those in between things are cancelling each other out. Believable? Yes.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so if you have finitely many things, I'll just add these little pieces in between and various things cancel each other out, and I'll get the integral of what is the integral of there. Okay, so if gamma 1 and gamma 2 are two curves which can be covered by disks in this manner, then the integral of gamma 1 is the integral of gamma 2. Okay, I just do this business finitely many times. So when does this happen? When can I say that gamma 1 and gamma 2, okay, are two curves for which I can cover it by a family of disks, okay, so that this kind of things happen, okay? Or how far can I extend this? You see, now you will understand that I have gamma 1 and I have gamma 2. I can cover gamma 1 by family of disks, gamma 1 and gamma 2 by family of disks with us. Then suppose I have gamma 1 and gamma 1 and gamma 2. Suppose I have a gamma 3, and gamma 2 and gamma 3 are such that I can cover it by a family of disks which has this property. Then integral over gamma 2 will be integral over gamma 3. Yes? Then I have a gamma 3 and a gamma 4, which can be covered by a family of disks which satisfy this property. Then integral over gamma 3 will be equal to integral over gamma 4. Okay, and so on finitely many times. However, it need not be that gamma 1 and gamma 2 are covered by a family of disks which does this. Gamma 2 and gamma 3 are covered by a family of disks which does this. That does not imply that gamma 1 and gamma 3 can be covered by a family of disks that does this. Even then, I am saying that because gamma 1 and gamma 2 can be covered by a family of disks which does so and so, and gamma 2 and gamma 3 can be covered by a family of disks which does so and so. So the integral over gamma 1 is integral over gamma 2. Integral over gamma 2 is integral over gamma 3. Therefore, integral over gamma 1 is integral over gamma 2. Even though gamma 1 and gamma 2 even though gamma 1 and gamma 3 may not be covered by a family of disks which does this, and this. Gamma 1 and gamma 2 is a family, has a family of disks which does blah, blah, blah. Gamma 2 and gamma 3 has a family of disks which does blah, 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 blah. But gamma 1 and gamma 3 need not have a family of disks which does blah, 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 blah. Okay? So, even then, integral over gamma 1 is equal to integral over gamma 2 is equal to integral over gamma 3. If gamma 3 and gamma 4 have a family of disks which does blah, 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 then integral over gamma 3 is integral over gamma 4. So integral over gamma 1 is equal to integral over gamma 4. So this is the idea that I want to get out. Okay, when does this happen? So this is a good place to stop. I'm 3 minutes over time, so it doesn't matter. And those of you who have heard this earlier, some of you have, what I'm trying to get is that when are two paths homotopic? Okay, and homotopy is a topological property. It has nothing to do with holomorphicity. Okay, it has nothing to do with complex analysis. It has to do with shifting of paths. Okay, when can one path be homotopically deformed into another path? When can gamma 1 be homotopically deformed into a path gamma 2 inside that region omega? And in fact, that is why this notion of homotopy was introduced. Okay. The notion of homotopy was introduced precisely because you wanted to say that the integral over this path is the integral over that path when you're talking about holomorphic functions. Okay. So I will do this the next time round. So you will see that we are talking about analysis and this, that, and this. Suddenly I have to worry about homotopy of paths because I want the integrals to be independent of depending only on the endpoint of the paths. Okay. So as I said, always is mathematics is one subject, whether you do topology or you do this or that or whatever, it doesn't really matter. Any questions?